have you, Maria. The floor is yours.
Can you see well my slides?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. Excellent. So very happy to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. As it was mentioned, my name is Maria, and I work for the Genomics and Precision Medicine team at IQVIA. And today I would like to talk about how we can leverage data for better health. So before we start, just highlight the different blocks I will touch upon today. So first of all, I would like to explain to you what precision medicine is and how it can help move healthcare forward. Then I would like to emphasize, same as the other presenters did today, the power of connected data and the power of connected genomic data. And finally, to end the presentation, I would like to put some emphasis in how it's important that we all collaborate with each other and work together, because we might be able to connect the different pieces of information that we have, but this is really a collective endeavor that we all have to do and work together with each other. So before I start with the content, just a couple of words about IQVIA. IQVIA is a global data healthcare company. We have footprint over 100 countries, and a lot of the employees working at IQVIA have either a medical background or a scientific background with a PhD. So there's a strong data science and research expertise that really helps tackle the issues and the different projects when it comes to healthcare data. So let's start with precision medicine. You might know that precision medicine generally aims to prevent, diagnose, and treat disease by considering each person's unique genetic makeup, history, and lifestyle profile. When we have a good precision medicine framework in place, this will really have positive benefits and positive impact in several areas of healthcare. By instance, we can think about prevention, in which knowing the specific characteristics of a person will help us have better risk assessments and more accurately estimate the probability of a person of getting a specific disease. When it comes to diagnosis, if we have this precision medicine infrastructure or ecosystem, we will be able to more accurately identify the cause of a specific disease and provide a very tailored diagnosis for a specific patient. And finally, in the eventual case that disease really happens and that we need to treat it, if we know the specific characteristics of a patient, we will be able to identify which drugs, and more importantly, at which dosages those drugs are more suited and are safer for each individual patient. If we want to have this precision medicine framework I'm talking about, it's very important that we have information about the patient, and this means that we not only have to consider these factors or these different features that typically have been associated to have a direct impact in disease. You can think of, for example, lifestyle or family history or the treatment that that person receives. But it's also important that we consider factors that have an indirect impact in the person and that therefore indirectly affect the disease. For example, education or social economical status. All these factors will also influence the lifestyle of the person, will influence their overall well-being, and therefore will have an impact on the diseases they developed and how, for example, the treatment evolves in the eventual case that we need to provide or give some drugs to the person. If we have this precision medicine framework in place, and we see that more and more often this is becoming a regular clinical practice, we will be able to have these scenarios or these frameworks that this slide tries to show. This would be a typical example of a pharmacogenomic report in which we would have a physician that is telling a patient, hey, based on your genomic profile and other characteristics, there's a specific drug, in this case, codeine, that might be unsafe for you, and therefore let's discuss an alternative treatment. So we see that precision medicine technology and data will help us improve outcomes, also the quality of life of patients, and also be able to provide treatments that are safer, so we will have less adverse reactions to specific drugs. And overall, this will improve the healthcare system, will lead to saving cost for hospitals, and also saving cost for the whole healthcare ecosystem. Now, I mentioned data a couple of times already, and now that's what I would like to focus on, specifically the power of data, and also put some emphasis on genomic data specifically. So data can come from many different sources, and it can take different shapes and forms. As the presenter before alluded already, we can have a lot of data, but it's important that this data is curated. So we need to be able to connect these different data sources. We need to have them standardized so we can combine different data sets having different origins, and this way really get a real value and real insights from these connected data sets. As I said, data can come from different sources. For example, we can think about patient-generated data or data that comes from all of us in a way. If you think about it, we are all walking around with our smartphones and smartwatches, sometimes 24/7. We should ask ourselves, can we collect this data effectively? Can we find ways of using this data and getting insights out of it? And more importantly, bring these insights back to the patients, back to people, so they can maybe slightly change their behavior or modify their lifestyle to really have direct improvements on their healthcare and on their well-being. When it comes to translational research platforms, we might be able to build very rich databases or registry platforms, by instance, combining this data collected by patients and data that comes from the clinic, so data that clinicians have, and this way have these large connected databases that clinicians can use to provide more personalized insights and more specific information to patients, and this way move towards this precision medicine scenario that I discussed before. Sometimes it might not be needed to collect new data, and this would relate to the third block here. We might only have to repurpose data that we already have by accessing existing secondary data collections and run new real-world evidence studies. Maybe we can repurpose a data set in order to answer a new research question, or we might be able to combine new data sets to get a larger database, and this way also find new insights that we were not able to identify before. So we can be creative here and just use effectively the data we already have, making it standardized so we can combine it and really get new answers and new research done with what is out there already. And finally, the last block relates to new data sources, for example, genomics. Can we collect new data types, such as genomic information, so we can combine it with all these other data types that I already mentioned to accelerate research and be able to move faster to this precision medicine framework for patients and get this genomic information that will really help in specific situations, for example, in rare diseases that very so often have a very strong genomic component, or oncology. There's a lot of tumors that also are driven by specific mutations. Can we therefore incorporate genomic information into these cases so we can bring precision medicine to the general population and to patients? We see that each of these different data sources are getting more adherence and are growing faster and faster. A clear example is real-world evidence. We've seen that after the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an increased real-world evidence adoption. Because of the pandemic and because of this new disease, we were really in a rush to understand how the treatments were working. We needed to develop new vaccines. We needed to see which ones were safe, which ones were not. So there was really an urgency to get information about this new disease. And because of that, really, research was accelerated in this field. And same is happening with genomic data. Just yesterday, actually, it was on the news that there's going to be a new sequencer by Illumina that will allow us to super fast sequence genomes at a full genomes at a very affordable price. And we see that because this falling cost of next generation sequencing, this type of data is also more so often accessible, and we are able to incorporate this type of information not only in research, but also in clinical practice. We can think about different types of genomic data. For example, we can have whole genome sequencing, in which we really take the full genome, we get the information of a full sequence of a person. Of course, this is the most time-consuming and the most costly type of genomic information. But as I said, even that is getting very affordable, and soon we will be able to almost sequence everyone that wants to have their genomic information obtained. We can also think about whole exome sequencing, in which we will only collect specific parts of the genome that code for proteins. This will be less expensive and less time consuming. And even though we are only getting 1.5% of the genome, because this part of the genome codes for proteins, we are able to use this information in a lot of research and also for clinical practice. And finally, the least expensive and the easiest to obtain is if we want to only collect a specific hotspots or single nucleotide polymorphisms of the genome, even though this is even less part of the full genome, only 0.5%. A lot of these specific mutations are associated with specific diseases, with specific conditions. So they are already super useful when it comes, for example, to provide risk estimates for specific diseases. We can combine all these mutations together and provide scores to people, for example, to tell them what are the chances to develop breast cancer and other diseases. So this we can already use for clinical practice, and it's relatively easy to obtain and very affordable nowadays. We also must think that maybe not always it's needed to obtain genomic information. So we should ask ourselves when it's more relevant to have genomic data, for which situations. I alluded already that for some specific diseases and for some specific conditions, such as oncology and rare diseases, which have a very strong genomic component, having this type of information, it's very valuable, and we should really strive that everyone that potentially might have a rare condition or an oncological disease that has a strong genomic component, just get the data for those patients, because it really helps in the diagnosis and in the treatment of the disease. Also, if we want to move towards the precision medicine framework and provide target therapies and be very specific in which drugs we give to people, in what combinations and in what dosages, there also it will be very relevant to have genomic information. And we see that clinical practice is starting now to sequence patients and providing this type of services or treatments for them. And in this slide here, I don't aim to overwhelm you, but I just want to emphasize on the fact that obtaining this type of data and bringing it together comprises different steps, and it can be sometimes challenging. So we need to make sure that we have the right resources and the right tools in each of these blocks in order to be able to help clinical decision making and bring these insights to patients. Just very quickly, when we think about it, if we have the population or the patients in a hospital, we will need to, first of all, collect these samples to obtain the genomic sequence. These samples will need to go to the lab. The DNA will need to be obtained. This DNA then will need to go through several bioinformatic and computational pipelines in order to obtain processed genomic data. Same will happen with clinical data. We heard before about the FAIR principles we will need to get this clinical information, make sure that that information is findable, accessible, and reusable, that it's in standard formats, so it can be interoperable and that everyone can use it. And then we, of course, need to bring these two types of data together in order to be able to create health reports and bring these healthcare insights back to patients. So far, I only mentioned clinical and genomic data, but more and more often we will see that there's going to be other types of data. For example, imaging information, these especially for neurological diseases or cancers in which we take a lot of scans and a lot of images from the tumors and the patient. It will be very valuable if we can also bring this information together with the clinical and genomical information in order, and we do the diagnosis and the treatments, and we just overall provide insights to patients. And same applies to wearable information that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. If we are able to just get all this data that we all have in our smartwatches and put it together into these huge databases, we will be able to provide more specific and tailored insights for the population and for patients. And the use cases of all these type of data, and specifically genomic data, are huge in all different areas of clinical research. For example, when it comes to understanding disease, mutations can really help us diagnose and also understand the population level incidence of a specific disease in a specific population. When it comes to drugs and medication, we will be able to identify new molecular targets and also repurpose existing drugs that can be used to treat different diseases. For clinical trials, it will be extremely valuable as well to, for example, be able to have more optimized patient selection when we define the clinical trials by stratifying for more specific values, such as genomic data or lifestyle factors. All this type of information can really help us have the most suited group of patients for a specific clinical trial. And finally, when it comes to diagnosis or pharmacogenomics, I already gave several examples, but if we have all this information for a specific person, we will of course be able to have a much more specific diagnosis. And also in the eventual case that we need to treat the person, we will be able to identify the likelihood of a positive response and also make sure that there are not adverse reactions or that the patient just responds badly to the combination treatment that we were typically suggesting. And finally, in the last block of the presentation, I would like just to emphasize that in order to make this successful, there are multiple pieces at play and multiple stakeholders that play a role into this, and we all need to work together to make sure that we really leverage data and get as most possible insights out of it. So I'm just saying we have to work together. There's a lot of people that can help into this precision medicine ecosystem. If you think about it, patients typically will talk to physicians, and physicians will talk back to patients. But also at the same time, these physicians will talk to the other people in the hospital and will talk to pharmaceutical companies. And at the same time, we will have, and we see that more and more, that there's a lot of medtech companies with impressive and amazing technology that can really push innovation forward. And typically, these medtech companies will talk to consumers, and consumers are more and more demanding every time. So the conclusion is that we all need to talk to each other. And if we want to make sure that patients get better outcomes and that we bring all these data breakthroughs and technological breakthroughs quicker to patients, we need to make sure that we work together and that we leverage data, but we also leverage each other to really bring innovation and data insights forward and faster. And if we want to have these successful collaborations, it's very important that we have good health data practices in place. It was also mentioned before in the previous talks that technology plays a very important role in that. We need to make sure that we use the technology that is out there to organize and manage these huge databases in these huge sources of information. And for that, standards and fair data practices are very important to ensure interoperability and make sure that we are able to exchange data, that we can pull data together, and this way have these large, rich databases that brings us the insights that we are looking for. And it's crucial that we make sure that these exchanges are based on secure data connections, so we ensure security and protection of this data at all times. We must not forget that this is patient information, people's information, and we need to make sure that the data is securely saved and that only data is accessed by people that should have access to it. And therefore, this links to the last point, which we need to make sure we protect sensitive data by having good data policies, make sure that sensitive data is encrypted, and that overall we have good data management practices. And I think also overarching all these, we need to ensure that patients and in general the population are involved in these, that they always offer consent when it comes to sharing their personal data, and that consent is an informed consent, so they are really aware of what's happening with that information. And of course, this way we will be able to faster bring positive insights to them, and everyone will benefit from this. All this seems a bit challenging, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I believe there's many advances in each of these different blocks that will really help us make that possible. For instance, when it comes to poor clinical data linkage, we need to really exploit these data standards. We need to make use of new technologies such as natural language processing technology that will really allow us to extract and clean the data from medical reports, by instance. When it comes to the consent that I just mentioned in the previous slide, there's new tools such as e-consent tools that really will help us align with patients, align with the people offering their data to make sure that they know what is being done with their information. And an important piece here is technology. So technology will really help us organize all this data, interpret that data, and we have plenty already of data browsers, visualization tools, analytical tools, even tools that allow us to do federated analysis of the data, so the data doesn't need to move from their original place. The data can stay there, and we can just securely access it from the outside and analyze it without needing to move the information. When it comes to genomic data, we said that the costs are really dropping down, so more and more often it will be accessible to everyone. And there's already many good bioinformatic tools and genomic sequencers that allow this processing to be super smooth and accessible to even people that do not have a computational background or a bioinformatics background. So we will see that type of data more and more often. We must not forget about the privacy, so make sure that privacy and legal and ethical regulation stay at the same level and are able to cope with all this new technology that we've been discussing. And finally, I really want to emphasize as well on the data harmonization, the standards, ontologies, fair principles. We need to make sure that the data can be combined, that it can be accessible, because we can have tons of information, but if we are not able to get insights out of it, then the value is kind of lost. And just to finish, I would like to emphasize once more on the collaboration piece. If we work together, we can really move this ecosystem forward. For example, when it comes to clinical trials, we will be able to maybe find ways that are slightly different to how clinical trials are done right now, by instance, by putting a patient at the center, so making these clinical trials patient-centric. When it comes to data, again, we need to ask these questions. Are we collecting the right data? Are we using the data we have in a smart manner? Can we repurpose the data that we already have stored? Really consider all these questions to apply them and get the most insights out of these big data sets as soon as possible. For that, we will need new ecosystems that bring the different stakeholders together, that bring the different data sources together. And we can do that by collaborating with each other most of the time. And it will be important to have new business models and new infrastructures that allow us to do that. And I believe that this last block is, in a way, the key piece. I think that innovation will really help us in that and will really help us bring that value and these new applications quicker to patients and quicker into the healthcare ecosystem. And I think that sometimes, of course, we will need to create new things and be creative in finding new ways of approaching data and approaching healthcare. But very so often, it might be just a matter of getting inspired by other technologies, by other fields, by other stakeholders. And this way, we will really be able to just bring data and bring data insights to patients very quickly. This brings me to the end of the presentation. If there's time for a few questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Indeed, that was a great presentation, and we do have a question in the chat. I guess it was inspired by the last bits of you talking about the patient and the consent and the informed consent, more importantly. And he was actually asking, should we implement health literacy? At what point? Because this is difficult information to comprehend, even for scientists, let alone for patients that are first overwhelmed and scared and just confused. So how do we combat this problem, and when do we introduce this to the patient?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I'm a big advocate of education. I really believe it's the key to most of these. As I said, it's important that patients are informed, and indeed the timing on when to inform them. For example, if someone has just recently been diagnosed with a new cancer, you are not going to just bombard them with new information about genomics and clinical trials. They are just not going to listen. They are not going to positively receive that information. So I think overall, it would be great that we educate population before they are in this situation, such a cancer diagnosis. So in general, we are all better informed in the research that it's been done, the data that is collected, the new fields that are coming, the new technologies. So we are prepared when this situation really gets closer. It's a matter of education, I guess, just government initiatives as well, bringing that knowledge forward to the general population. It's key, I think. Yeah.
I agree. And we have one other question, just a quick one, because we are out of time. Do you know if all the patient needs across EMEA are the same, or is there a difference? And if yes, what is it?
I don't know exactly what differences are, but I'm sure there are differences. If you think about it, only when it comes to genomics, there's already you can stratify the population according to their genomic profile, and you can kind of see where they come from. So 100% sure that there's going to be difference. How large they are, this will really depend, I think, on what you are taking into consideration and what's your endpoint of interest in a way, and whether the difference really play a role in that. But for sure, there's going to be differences, yes.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed your time here, and hopefully we'll see you again next year.
Sure. Thank you.